Hi class, in following Dr. Price's footsteps, I also wanted to post a video this week to give you the announcements and also hopefully give you some help, some aid with an upcoming assignment you have this week with your word studies. And my name is Courtney Veazey, and it's been a pleasure to co-teach this class so far with Dr. Price, as well as interact with many of you through email and Blackboard. And I hope that this post will offer you some help, but of course we're always available for you to call or email if you need additional help as you approach this subject. But again, beginning in Unit 8 this week, congratulations on making it so far in the class, and in Unit 8 we're going to continue looking at what it is to get back as much as we can to meaning in the text, meaning that would have been as close as possible to what the original hearers would have heard and understood when they heard the first words of Scripture as they were spoken and read and written down. And then drawing our application from those meanings so that we're working towards the discipline of not taking the text out of context as we apply it to our modern culture. But this week also coming up, remember that you need to view the PowerPoints and continue in your reading with the Duval and Hayes text. And next week we'll start incorporating the Stewart and Fee text as well in the How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And you have a unit quiz, and then again, like we said on Saturday, to go into the next step of your working towards the exegetical paper, you have to do your word studies. Now with this word study, if you check the syllabus, it's very brief, just 2 to 3 pages, single space writing there. And what are we looking for? What am I looking for when I read your papers and I go over this? Well, first I want you to really read the passage, use tools, whatever you can, to look at the original languages in the text that you've chosen as well. And try to find a word in there that's significant. Not just any random word within the verse or the passage that you're doing, but find a word or a phrase that actually, depending on how you interpret it, how you understand it from the culture that it came from, can make a difference towards interpretation of the passage and application of that passage. And I want to know how these words, whether if you're doing Old Testament, how is it used, the Hebrew word, in the greater Near Eastern context? If you're doing New Testament with a Greek word, how was it used in the Greek context, in the Greco-Roman world? What's the greater usage of that world in the surrounding culture? And then how is it being used in the text to either reflect that or speak in a different way or whatnot? But we want to know, what is the background of that word and how is it being used? What's the etymology of it? If you can find out where it developed, how it developed, what construction is going on, all of that. We want more than just cursory information on this word. Give me something that impacts the interpretation and translation of the text. Just as an example, I want to give you some word studies out of one verse that comes out of 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7, and maybe also it'll serve as sort of a devotional for you as we think about spiritual vitality being the thing that we're focusing on this semester at school. And when you go to 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7, a very beloved passage that we've loved for a long time when we think about this as Christians and in our journeys and in fighting the good fight. And you remember there, St. Paul is reminding his young protege Timothy, who's in Ephesus, in this last letter that we have from the Apostle Paul, writing to Timothy there. And he says in verse 7, "For God has not given to us a spirit of fear, but of power and love," and a lot of translations in this last word say discipline. Some say sound mind. I want to give you a little bit of a translation there where I think it means healthy mind. And he's reminding Timothy to fan into the flames and these 4 gifts that God has given to him, given to all of us as believers, to carry out the work that we have ahead of us. And we'll see all 4 of these gifts play out in the rest of the book in the letter of 2 Timothy. But going back to think about word studies here, verse 7, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear." This word is very interesting. We have here for fear. In the Greek language, and especially in the New Testament, we see numerous words used for fear. One that's most common, as you might have heard before, is phobos, and phobia. It's where we get our English word from that. So arachnophobia, the fear of spiders, claustrophobia, the fear of being closed in. So we have phobia. Well, that's not what Paul has used here in this in this word to in verse 7 to say God has not given us a spirit of fear. It's not phobia. Another word that we use, or that we see in the New Testament, is tremo. And this is where we get our word for tremor, tremeo, tremo, depending on where it's being used. We see this in the book of Philippians when Paul says to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And isn't it interesting? We think of tremo, tremor, shaking, and this is where we get our word for trauma in the English language. And it's interesting how these make their way a lot into our medical terms. In our trauma centers, often people are trembling. So that's where we get that. Another word that we see for fear in the New Testament is putero, and puteromai is often how it's seen as well, especially in the dictionary. And from that word, putero, as you can probably hear, it's where we get our word for terror. And that means sort of a startled, frightened, just very scared initial emotion. And none of those are what we see here with Paul. We just see him using a word actually that is delios. And this is where we get our word for delirious. So it's very interesting, and one of the reasons why it's difficult for us to understand exactly what this word means here is because it's only used one other time two other times, but both in the Gospels, in Matthew's account and in Mark's account, in Matthew 8 and Mark 4 on the Sea of Galilee with Jesus and his disciples. And here Paul is saying, God hasn't given us a spirit of delios, of delirious. When Jesus uses it, I love when he says, men of little faith, why are you delios? Why are you delirious? And it really means a disorienting fear. You're so anxious that you can't even calm down enough to understand who's in control, who's in charge of these waves. And Jesus says, guys, you are delirious. You're so anxious you can't even think straight. And with Paul and Timothy, he's saying, my son, my child in the faith, God has not given any of us a spirit of delios, of disorienting fear. Don't be anxious, because you're going to need to keep a cool head there and not get involved in the civilian affairs and all the things that he's going to bring up there for Timothy and who to avoid and what the situation is. And he's going to have to understand you don't need to be afraid. You don't need to be anxious. Remember who's in charge. And so just an example of how a word study can change something there. About the interpretation and the application of it. And so when we think about this for our own lives, God has not given us a spirit of delios. So if there's ever a time that you're feeling disoriented in fear, and so much so that you can't even function, that's not from God. That's either from the enemy or your own flesh that's doing that, because God is in control. And he says, what else? He's given us a spirit of power and of love. Those are pretty easy words, just typical for power, the dunamis, and agape here for love. And then finally that last word, and sophronismo. I had to pronounce that out here in the Greek text. We have at the beginning of this word, at the end of that verse, sophroneos is really what that's coming from. And what that means, when we look it up in a lot of dictionaries, sound mind, healthy mind is probably one of the best translations that we find, because we're seeing two words be put together, sophroneo. So there at the beginning is short for soterios, or soter, where we get the word soteriology, the study of salvation. When the Septuagint writers were trying to figure out how to encompass the greatest word in the Old Testament, shalom, which means peace and wholeness, into the Greek language for the New Testament, one of the words, they picked a few words for peace, but one of the ones they chose to represent shalom from the Old Testament in the New is soter, which means salvation. So quite literally, to be saved means to be healthy and whole before God, or to have peace with God. We're healthy and I have peace. So that's a form of shalom in the New Testament. So we see the shortened so there. And then phroneos, phrono, and that literally in medical terms today is the frontal lobe of your brain, the executive part of where you make decisions. We have that in our medical words. So put them together, sophroneos, sound, whole, healthy mind. So literally you could say there, God has given us, not a spirit of disorienting fear, but of power, love, and a healthy mind. He's given Timothy a good mind, he gave Paul a good mind, and he's given each of us a good, healthy mind so that we can continue to carry out the work that is before us and to stay strong in the journey and in the fight of life and ministry and all that involves. And so, again, just a brief few word studies in one verse that can make a whole big difference in how we apply that into anyone's life today that's listening to us teach. So that's the kind of thing we're looking for in your assignment. I pray that encourages you today as you're reminded of these things, that just as Timothy received these from God, so do we as well. So best of luck this week and keep pressing on. Fall break is right around the corner, and we look forward to journeying with you throughout the rest of the semester. Thanks. Bye-bye.